Okay, thank you. Welcome to the last week of Political Ideas. This is going to be a pretty rushed job because I want to talk about some of the major things of the 20th century, some of which I've anticipated, brought in tangentially, and in the second half of the lecture, I will focus upon what I consider the dominant paradigm now operating in the humanities in terms of ideas. And I'll talk a little bit about its roots and its scope. And indeed, one of the reasons I do that, because that kind of narrative and that way of seeing things, one of the reasons it's been so successful institutionally, and its success can be measured by the kind of policies that are now part and parcel of a university education. So it's not only specific teachers or even specific courses, but it's a complete transformation of the curriculum and what is seen as valuable. So there's a paradigmatic shift that's very important, and I want to look at why that shift occurred and how it operates. And this is why in all my classes I always end up talking about this great social revolt of the 1960s, because I'm of a strong conviction that these ideas have so transformed society that you will have come across them in various degrees. And I will try to go into a little bit of depth, of course, in a very rapid way. Now, if we go back to the turn of the 20th century, we'll see how different it is to the 21st century. And one of the big things was the persistence of nationalism. And when I discussed nationalism, I emphasized how nationalism is really a modality of human solidarity, ultimately that pits itself against empire. And the great breakup of the European empires ultimately was caused by nationalism, and the empires would dissolve into nations, and indeed the post-colonial resistances that occurred throughout much of the 20th century invariably were nationalist. Now that has all changed, as you know, Chris, because in the Muslim world, the development and growth of pan-Islamism is now very, very important because the nation-state is not capable. And I emphasized throughout that the political ideas that we study, they are essentially responses to very specific circumstances. And the specific circumstances, or rather the circumstances that gave birth to the ideas of nationalism, are very much part and parcel of the Western experience. As I said, they then become appropriated by the elites operating in the colonies as they seek to decolonialize, but the success of them in either Africa or the Middle East has been, at best, not that great. It hasn't been that successful. And simply because all political institutions, they depend upon a social base, and that social base is also culturally configured. So that's just the way it is. So with nationalism being so important, coming into the 20th century, one of the things that's most noticeable about the 20th century is how there's a reinvigoration of nationalism at the end of the First World War, specifically in the ideologies of National Socialism and fascism. Benito Mussolini went into the war as a Marxist, and indeed Lenin had said of Mussolini that he was the best Marxist in Europe, and indeed Mussolini was the editor of the Italian Marxist newspaper called Avanti. So he went into the war, and what did he see? What did he witness? He saw people are prepared to die for their nation more than they are to die for their class. And this was the roots of his moving from being a Marxist to a nationalist. And Marxist theory, as I may have pointed out when I spoke of Marx, nationalism is just for Marx, just a false ideology. Whereas communism is an internationalist phenomenon at the ground up, which, by the way, is true of liberalism. liberalism in its pure ideological economic form, which is what globalists today are working very much with. This. They might have some social democratic features that they add to it, but essentially it's a liberal economic view of life. That is, resources, and human resources also, should gravitate to wherever it is required in order to get an optimum cost benefit. The question is, and one of the earliest theorists of nationalism, even though he's much more than that, this is a character Herder I spoke about a few lectures ago. He pointed out that the ideas of the nation and a people and its language are so interrelated and bound up together that it's really the feeling, the sentiment that forms the basis, if you like, of their epistemic or their ways of making sense of the world, of their knowledge. And I think this was really right, because if that is right, then that would explain why it's been so difficult for pure liberalism or communism in the way Marx envisaged it to come out the way that he had hoped it would come out. Because people just aren't like that. It's a simple answer. And even when we look at what happened with the Soviets, it was very, very manifest that it was really the Russian Empire by another name. And Stalin had come up with the doctrine of socialism in one country, which of course was opposed by Leon Trotsky. I mentioned this to you too in that other course. But the problem with Trotsky's position was, it was a fact that socialism, at least of a sort, had taken hold in Russia. To be sure, it was held together by a police state apparatus, but it nevertheless had succeeded, I put in quotation marks. So when Stalin said you have to protect where communism has been successful, and that is in socialism in one country, he's really just acknowledging the facticity of what it is. And I think but you can see there, once he's done that, nationalism is going to be intrinsic to the ideology. And of course, when the Second World War occurred, Stalin's speeches are full of appeals to the fatherland. They're patriotic speeches. And I'll just go back to the First World War again and just say, one of the things that broke the spirit and the heart of people like Lenin and Trotsky was the fact that Germans and Frenchmen and the British, they all lined up patriotically when it came to the war. So in France and in Germany, they both supported the working class through its representatives, both supported engagement in the war, because the nation preceded class, and that's why that was Mussolini. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go in this class into details about nationalist socialism and fascism. I will just make this more general point. I do go into that in Introduction to International Relations. But I will just say this, that much of the 20th century was a three-way contest between the ideologies of communism, the nation-state kind of liberalism, and fascism/national socialism. And the national socialist fascist one was essentially defeated, even though sort of remnants lingered on, you could say, in Spain and in Portugal and Greece with the dictatorship. But it was never the same exactly as what the national socialists were, or Latin American countries. It was never the same, because it had ultimately been absolutely wiped out. And that's why any neo-fascist groups are really insignificant. They have no social roots at all behind them. They're disgruntled, they're marginalised, they may speak big, they may have big papers, and some journalists seem to, and even academics, seem to want to magnify their existence. I think this is silly. And of course, communist then and nation-state liberalism carries on to the Cold War. And communism, of course, survives as a political form, but not an economic form in China. And then you've got a few other, states where the elite who are communists have taken hold, they can't let go. They're not sure what to do. Vietnam, for example, or Laos. But everything, all the perceptual grids of academicians, geopolitical strategists, almost universally was ignoring anything that didn't fit into the nationalist framework. That's how strong an ideology it was. It was just like you just take it for granted. And then when the Iranian Revolution happened, some people, but not all, pointed out there's something bigger going on in the Islamic world. And they were right. But there were many, when it happened, still wanted to frame it as essentially a nationalist phenomenon. And the other thing that accompanies the nationalist, that kind of ideology, is another bit that comes out, which is also intrinsic to liberalism and to some extent Marxism. And that is the importance of freedom and equality. So many people would say that it's the issues of social equality and inequality that are the most important variables that you need to look at. Now, I was listening, for example, to a show called Fault Lines, which I sometimes listen to. It's on Sputnik Radio, the Russian radio, with this guy Lee Stranahan and Garfield Nixon. They're all under the map politically, but I find them sometimes infuriating, sometimes quite very insightful. So they're there. But they had this guy on this morning. He said some very good things, but at one point he said, people ignore the essential thing, it's social inequality. That's what drives the show. And I just think, well, that's not how everybody thinks at all. That's not how everybody all around the world thinks. Of course, if you're talking about a degree of inequality that's not simply, very different pay scales, but you're actually talking about life and death inequality, okay, starvation inequality, mass poverty inequality, then of course that's going to play a role. But the Western mind has tended to take these bastions of liberalism, socialism, and nationalism as the primary parameters with which you assess what is going on. I think this is wildly mistaken. And I think it's wildly mistaken for the reasons that Herder said. I think culture really, really matters. And I think equality and liberty were two features of Western experience, which one of my favourite political thinkers, who I've only mentioned in passing in this course, is a guy called Alexis de Tocqueville, Tocqueville, he was actually a politician as well as a terrific historian, in my opinion, and sociologist. He points out, look, these have really taken root. There's no way around this. We do have to accept this in the West. So it's no use fighting this. And I think he was absolutely right about that. And I think there's a really strong backlog of sentiments and habits that go back to the Reformation at least, and even preceding that, which feed into why these abstractions take such a root, why they take on such importance. And when we talk about, in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to look at especially this post-structuralist anti-domination theory. You can see freedom and equality really drive their stories as well. And of course, freedom and equality then become turned against the liberal view of the world because it's seen as, by the left, the political left, to use a very shabby term, but it's appropriate in something like this, that you can see, or you can make the argument, and it's not wrong, I don't say this is wrong, okay, that in so-called liberal democratic societies, there's a number of people that lack freedoms, and there's all sorts of social inequalities in operation. I wouldn't disagree with that. The question is the scale and the significance, and the other question is, how do you rectify that? Is it something that can be rectified? So when I was listening to that show, I'll go back to Sputnik this morning, Garland Nixon, who I really like this guy. He's a very left-wing guy, and I think he's really great. But he said this thing, I think this is really stupid, and I know it's a big part of his thinking. That's the bit I always tune out when he goes there. And he said, yes, he said, what you're saying is it's the system. Now, my generation, you know, it's the system, man. We all used to say this in the 90s. It's the system, right? It's the system. Now, the problem is, let's say that's true. It's systemic. In fact, I agree with that. I agree that the reason things happen the way they are is not solely because of personalities, though I don't want to completely discount that, because where the gaps and lacuna are within the system, I don't think you know. I think we don't know. And you know why we don't know? Because you can't occupy any strategic vantage point when you have a complete comprehensive knowledge of what the system is. So when you say it's a system, that's fair enough to say there is a system and we're in it. But when you try to define the essential drivers of it, and then you think you can occupy a position where you can see all that, not only see it, but then you can change the system to get the outcome you want, then I think you're being start rating bonkers. And here I'm very Nietzschean. Remember Nietzsche's idea of will to power and perspectivalism? I think Nietzsche has hit on something really true and important, and that is the way we filter knowledge is invariably backed up through the experiences that we've accrued and which we inhabit. So we're inhabiting a modality of experience. So we, you know, the narratives, they get filtered through that, the narratives that we come up with, that's all part of that. But no matter who you are, you're going to be trying to change your perception of the system from within the system, so you can't possibly know the systemic consequences of what you're doing till you've seen them in circulation, how they're playing out with all those other aspects of this thing we're calling the system, which are concealed from your view. You can't know it. I can't emphasize this enough, you know. And this becomes a key problem of all the ideologists and all the ideas makers that are seeking to control the future. They cannot see the consequences of what they're doing, because none of us can. It's like, just think in your own life. You just think in your life what you think will happen and then what happens. And it doesn't get easier as there's billions of people more involved. It gets more and more complex by the, you know, micro, milliseconds, you know? So, but, and this is something, again, in this other course I really strongly emphasized, and which I've touched on here. When you have a massification of an elite education system, and that system reproduces itself through knowledge, and knowledge itself is bound up actually not really with real knowledge, but with kind of consensual practices, techniques that fit the practice, you are very easily, in my opinion, going to be misled into thinking that the knowledge you have is the knowledge that suffices for understanding the reality that you've been trained to understand. You've been trained to understand it and, indeed, perhaps to improve it. So this whole idea of progress and improvement, but when you actually come to your little bit of reality, that's all you can work upon. And you can only work upon it with the resources you have. Which is why, of course, as soon as any political party gets into power and it wants to implement a program, why it starts having to do deals and sell out, and you can say sell out and all these things. It's impossible that it will be otherwise. Okay. Now, so that's one big picture. I've just given you that picture. Now there's another picture that I think is really important, and this is going to, I want to address, if you like, the more two mainstream positions that had evolved within the liberal democratic world. Okay. And quite simply, it's the shift in consensus that took place from what was essentially the consensus of liberal democratic states in the earlier part of the 20th century, which in the main, the US in some ways is something of an exception, and there's strong sociological reasons for that, but it would be wrong to push this too far. And I would say generally the consensus was social democratic. And if you want to know, the quick, short, sharp version of why it'd be wrong to completely exclude the United States from this is in the words Franklin Delano, Roosevelt. With the New Deal. The New Deal was essentially a social democratic model. Now, if you look at the National Socialists, you can see all sorts of social democratic aspects in operation there. So when you're talking about the social democratic model, what you're looking at is a political model which tries to mitigate against too great inequalities, so they tend to be much higher in taxation. At the same time, you're talking about the identification of public goods, the provision of perhaps health services. Again, the US is somewhat of an exception there, but definitely the schooling system, and all sorts of other, and perhaps nationalisation of certain industries. Now, this is very crude, but it's not wrong. This consensus tended to dominate until around the 1970s. And there were opponents of this consensus, and one of the most famous of them is this man on the right called Friedrich von Hayek. Friedrich von Hayek argued that this consensus was actually socialism by stealth. And his fear of socialism as an economist was that ultimately socialism would be a very unproductive system. That consumption signals would be too mixed up by the state's intrusion. Now, I'll just roll it back a bit and say, Hayek was not arguing that you can completely eliminate the state or that the state didn't have a role to play in providing certain services. He did not argue that. He did argue, though, that the term social justice was very pernicious. Whether you agree with him or not, I'm just giving you his position. He argued it was very pernicious because that meant interference in resource flow and allocation, which would ultimately not even benefit those that are supposed to be the targets of that. Or to put it very bluntly, he was arguing that you create a welfare dependency by having too much welfare. That's again, I'm really being very succinct in this formulation, so somewhat crude. And he argued very much against John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes had argued that the state could use its position to help restart, reboot the economy when it came up against the periodic crises, which are indeed part and parcel of the way capitalism works. Marx had an explanation for that. I think there's another explanation for it. I think Marx gets it wrong. I think the explanation for it really comes down to credit expansion. But credit expansion becomes feverish because everything is on the way up. And people who have investments want to make more money. Very understandable situation. Anyway, but Hayek argued very strongly against that. And he also argued that the Keynesian kind of model would tend to be inflationary. It would be inflationary because it would often just print money. The way out of a problem was printing money. This, by the way, it was a very Keynesian solution that occurred after 2008 with the United States, where the United States, with that financial crash, remember it supported the big banks and financial institutions. And in part, that's a very complex. I don't want to go too far into it. Again, I'll give you a quick summary of it. But the essential thing was that the state had also benefited from the opening up of finance capital, which is due to exactly the kind of things that Hayek was talking about, which he saw as desirable, but he didn't really see it playing itself out this way. It was, again, a good example of someone not realizing the consequences of all this. Because by opening up finance capital, but there was a certain dynamic and a cost, what the economists called opportunity cost involved. One of the reasons that finance capital had been opened up to the degree it was in the United States was it was a means to try and help people in the housing market as well. And basically the banks did a quid pro quo with the United States government in which, okay, you're going to sinecure a number of these loans, but give us a free hand to compensate for that. And they said, fine. Now, one of the consequences of that was interest rates died bombed. Money was easier to get hold of because the flows, resource flows, and capital profits increased exponentially. Okay, in the short term, it was a very good thing. But ultimately, the means and mechanisms that the banks were using to do this were disastrous. And they all hit in 2008. So here you got a government, and remember, it was George Bush initiated an idea, and Obama kept the idea. So I don't think it was party political at all. I can see exactly why it was done. The consequences of not doing it would have been very, very bad. The consequences of doing it were very bad. But maybe there's one was even worse than the other. But the reason the state ultimately bailed out these huge investment capital sites was because the massive unemployment checks they would have had to have garnered, plus they were getting such cheap loans, they had become addicted to it. And one of the issues in a democracy is each party goes to the electorate trying to buy some votes. They're all doing that. That's the nature of the system. That's not good or bad. It's just what people do. They have a new platform. It's like this we were mentioning the Australian election. You know, the Labor Party were trying to buy the votes of young people, wealthy inner city people, and the Liberals ultimately recognised that their hopes might be in those other seats where you had coal miners and, you know, other working class members that were more financially vulnerable in some ways. And older. Age was a big issue in that. So, ultimately, Hayek was pushing for deregulation. And Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, in different ways, achieved that. And, of course, this also played a big impact, ultimately, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Who did they turn to? They were all reading Hayek. Hayek had predicted, and as did his teacher, a guy called Ludwig von Mises, who's a very liberal, anti-nationalist liberal economist, globalist liberal economist, had predicted exactly why socialism would fail because of the planning mechanisms involved in that and the lack of a genuine price system. They were right. There's no way around that. They were absolutely right. China, much smarter, decided it would restructure the economy more along those lines, not completely, but more along those lines. And in part, where it was developmentally in terms of infrastructure and building up, what they did was a very traditional model of state involvement in the economy, but freeing up other bits of the economy. So it was a very mixed economy. And in fact, the development of the modern state economically is a dialectic of state and economy, which is impossible to completely sever. I may have said this before, but I'll give you a very good example, seeing you're going to be a lawyer, Chris. When we think of capitalist societies, that's the nomenclature that comes out of the left. And I think this is a misnomer. But where you have societies where there's a certain degree of freedom, and I'm not making any argument here about exactly what and where and how much that freedom should be. I think that's a very technical, a very complicated issue around policy that you cannot decide on a priori. But so many people who write about politics or talk about it speak as if it's a priori. They use the word like regulation, as if that's a talisman of some sort. You just need to regulate. Well, it depends what the regulations are. Again, you've got to look at the opportunity costs. You've got to look at industry by industry. You've got to look at the condition of your economy, where you're located. There's so many variables that you need to consider. But this way of speaking about it is just, in my opinion, absolutely dumb. So, the modern state, the modern Western industrial state, has two components. It has the state itself, and then it has all these players within the market, and there's two primary employers. You're either a state employer or you're working for somebody, perhaps self-employed, but you're working for a company or something. So there's two major employers, and you've each got your economic agency. Whatever skill set you come out with, you're going to try and sell that. Now, there's certain things that states do, and there's certain things markets do. And this is a really crude, but it's not incorrect. What a state can do is force a group of people to do certain things under pain of punishment, which may mean revenue loss, but it may mean imprisonment. But you have, that's what ultimately what politics is getting people to do something that you, as the elite members of the state, whether you're the crown, whether you're a dictator, whether you're democratically elected, you're forcing people to be caught up in a certain transference of resources from A to B to C, and you're forcing them to do certain things or prohibiting certain things. That's what states do. If you're in the private sector, you may have to, in fact you will have to deal with all those aspects. But then, there's avenues for you to try and make something to sell it. So you're trying to go to market and you're trying to sell something. Now, it's the interplay of those two things that ultimately defines the economic and social and political, or the political and economic base of modern industrial societies. Now, I've just mentioned those two things. But let's bring in the lawyers, because what transpires in the marketplace may be such that there's, in fact, frequently is such, that there are losers. So, for example, I'm a company making medical products, and my medical products do a great deal of damage. In my lifetime, the thalidomide story was a big story. It was a drug given to pregnant women, and babies were born, without their extended limbs, their arms especially. And there hadn't been the right amount of research to check this. So, of course, now what happens? And there's numerous instances we can move way outside of the... But what happens is there's negligence has taken place by the company, and lawyers will come in to defend those that have suffered by that negligence, right? The lawyers, most of them are going to be in, their own private companies. So here in the private sector, you've got the law in operation. Well, what is the consequence of that? And many of these lawyers are very happy to take up class actions. That's a huge part of understanding the role of what's going on in modern states. Is the role of class actions, but also tort law more generally. So what is the impact of doing that? Well, the immediate impact is this leads to legislative transformations. So that's something that's coming out of the market system, that's coming out of people making a profit. The lawyers are all making profit, but nevertheless has a feedback loop into state and legislation. So you can see how interpenetrative they are. So that's the simple point I want to make. You can't really separate the state from the private sector as if each one could subsist by their own. And that was another failure of Marx. He treated it as such. In fact, he thought you could dissolve both and come up with some third thing, which was the spontaneity of producers, which is, to me, the kind of idea you dream up in a pub over a few pints of beer when you're 19 or 20 years old. Okay. So, although there was a big push in the 1970s, now, does anyone Can anyone think of one massive social transformation that occurred in the 1970s? Huge social transformation. Huge. In the West. Lots of women joined the labour force. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a criticism, right? Economics doesn't work that way. But what it meant was that the labour force grew exponentially. So you had more and more people in the workforce, but many of the people involved in the workforce were members of the same household, right? And so, you know, married couples living together, married couples. Now you've got men and women. This ultimately contributed. It wasn't the only thing, but it was a contributing factor to what essentially was a high level of unemployment because you had more people looking for work, but also inflation because you had more people. Now more households had more money. So it was a double whammy. And the dependency of the welfare state and the massive taxation, and you know, in the United Kingdom, for example, in the 1960s, you know, rock and roll bands would sing about this. The Beatles had a song called Taxman, because they were losing, you know, 95% of their earnings. That's how they took it. They were paying that in tax. They were hugely taxed. The Kinks had a song called "The Taxman's Taken All My Dough," you know, blah, blah, blah. So this was happening. So the state is reaching a kind of, it's got this problem. It's got the problem of inflation. So it's an economic problem that's actually caused by social transformation. The way that one could see a way out of this was to follow someone like Hayek, and that is, look, lower the burden of taxation, and in lowering the burden of taxation, that will lead to more people being able to invest in the economy and therefore appoint people. Now, one obvious rejoinder to that is, hang on, but the state is also an employer, so the state is actually paying people. So then the issue is, and it's a purely technical question, and this is often treated by critics of what happened, and I'm not being a critic or a supporter of this, I'm just describing it, right? But I've seen, and there's a guy on YouTube, I can't remember his name, but he's quite well known, and he's a left-wing economist, and this is the argument that a left-wing economist would make. And he goes, yes, but money's going into the system. This is Keynesian. Money's going into the system, so what's wrong with that? Can anyone think what might be wrong with that economically? Because you've got money in the system. If the money's in circulation, then you've got consumers and producers. But that's the word. That's the operative word. I said producers. So it becomes a question of how efficient is the production to support the consumption. How efficient is it? If it's not very efficient, and this, I'll tell you what, efficiency became a real buzzword in the 1970s, and under Thatcherism and under Reagan and all of that, because they pushed this a lot. And the answer was, if you had a nationalised company, and this was something that really affected the coal industry in Great Britain in the 1980s. And I was there, I witnessed it, you know, and I saw the reactions. And it was heartbreaking for people employed in the coal industry, which is an irony, isn't it, given what the Greens think about coal miners now. But then the left was all supporting the coal miners. Everyone on the left supported the coal miners back then. But the problem was, if it was inefficient, then the revenue you're raising, you're caught between needing to raise revenue, but the revenue you're raising is not increasing profitability at a rate that will enable you to go and spend more revenue. And see, you're caught up in this. You're caught up. It's a cat by its tail. So, what essentially happened in the so-called, and this is often called neoliberalism. You will hear of this time and time again. I'm sure you've heard of it many times. And I'm afraid it's a very bad term. There's so many, our world is, in my opinion, full of very bad ideas. And this was a very bad idea. That is, the very name was a bad idea. And I'll tell you what was a bad idea, because everything I've said so far sounds very liberal, so you can see why it's neoliberal. But then pay attention to the next bit. And in part, it includes the social transformation as well. The state ultimately was required to, if it wanted to do this, if it wanted to get rid of the problems of what was called stagflation, inflation, high unemployment, it had to find some way out of this impasse. And the way out of that impasse was to sell off national industries that weren't making profit. And Great Britain did it in the 1970s, Reagan rolled back all sorts of things, and Australia did it with the Labour Party in the 1980s. And other countries in Western Europe, to various degrees, some of them not so much like France, but to various degrees, were caught up in the same kind of logic. Now I don't think they had a choice. But then what happened? There's another bit to the story. Remember, I said there's a social transformation. One of the things that had also been happening was the development of the professional elites, because professional elites are needed to control the system, to manage the system, was the growth in a managerial class. Now, the difference between management and someone who starts, the difference between someone who goes to university, gets an MBA, and learns how to manage any firm, and someone who starts a company and watches it grow and grows up from the inside, I think you could see straight away they're very different. One has learned a skill set that's applicable anywhere. The other has a skill set that's really intrinsic to the practice it's engaged in. The one is very specific. And the entrepreneur is not a manager. That's really important. And the failure to have entrepreneurs within the social system is a big part of its economic problems. So you had all these people going to business schools, all going to MBAs. And they started in the United States. Great Britain didn't have an MBA, a business program, until the very early 1960s. And they start to spread like wildfire. So now you have a group of economic agents requiring a service to manage, something to manage. And essentially what happened was another thing. And again, it fitted into the narrative of efficiency. The public sector, which includes universities, was sitting there waiting for this new professional elite to come in and manage it. Now, I've got a very close friend who I just seeing in Korea, a very good old friend of mine, who wrote a book, not a book, a chapter on a book I edited about revolutions. And he wrote a chapter on managerial revolutions. And he said, I remember the day my dad came home from work, and he was a GP working in a hospital, and he had had a lot of status in the hospital. And he said, they just introduced these managers. They don't know anything about the operation of the hospital, but they're now going to control everything. And that came with a certain narrative, which is what you learn when you're part of the profession. You come in with a narrative. The narrative is supposed to supply the skill set. And you oversee the operation. But, of course, what you're looking for is efficiency. Now, here's another irony. Remember me talking about Hayek, and one of the really important points that he made, remember I said he predicted why planned economies would fail. The reason that planned economies would fail, he argued, is because there's no real testing going on of the success or failure of what you're producing. Because the price is, so if you produce 1 million left shoes, by God, everyone in the Soviet Union who buys a pair of shoes is going to be walking around with 2 left shoes. They're stuck with it. because you haven't had the time, or it's taken so long, the feedback loop isn't there. Whereas if you're a small business making shoes, you'd go broke immediately. And even if you're a big business making shoes, unless you manage to get the state to support you, you just go broke. You just go broke. So capitalism is a system in which things thrive, that fail. You know, this company is doing awfully well one day, then it goes broke. That's the system. Unless the state comes in to protect it, to ring-fence it, which is exactly what happened in the 2008 crash. But as I said, it's very understandable why the state came in, because the consequences would have been so severe. In the long run, you could say the system, as a capitalist system, so-called, or even as a state and capital nexus, would have been better served by that, but there would have been a very big sacrifice that politically you couldn't risk that. So the way the economist sees things and the way you see things politically, they're going to be at loggerheads. So, what happened with the public sector? How do you take a university, a school, a hospital, a public library, and how do you introduce market mechanisms, genuine market mechanisms, when you're absolutely reliant upon state funding? And the answer is, you bullshit. You totally make it up. And you know what you do? You actually replicate what planned economies were doing. Because the thing about planned economies, it's not that they didn't itemize. They itemized every damn thing in the system. It's not that they didn't itemize. But the itemization all occurred around a plan and a pseudo price. And that's exactly what happened in the public sector. So, the so-called neoliberal... and there are some other trade-offs. This is really important. Because I work at a university and I saw this happen, and I just want you to be aware of this. Another trade-off was that capital now had greater free flow, especially in finance capital, but then it very quickly moved to industrial capital, which is why in Australia, and it was the Labor Party that did this, and it's funny because in the 1970s, Victoria was Liberal heartland, now it's Labor heartland. Okay? So, in the 1980s, it was the Labor Party that got rid and essentially destroyed the textile industry in this country because they were heavily subsidised or ring-fenced by tariffs, which are the two traditional nationalist ways of, which is what Trump is, by the way, doing. He's bringing back a very social democratic platform. I've said this in a number of times in some other classes, I don't know if I've said it here, but people don't get this, and I'm amazed because they just get caught up in rhetoric rather than looking at the substance of policy. You've got to look at substance, forget the rhetoric. Anyway, so while this was all happening, so what did capital want from this? And one of the things it did is just as it was buying up certain industries, it wanted to offload the educational costs that were being incurred within its companies. So apprenticeships and things like that were being offloaded. This was the beginning of TAFE colleges in this country, and the equivalence thereof in the United Kingdom. Now, you could make arguments one way or the other about whether this is good or bad, but that was a fact. So, what happened? What happened here? So that when you see the word neoliberal, I want you to use your brains and not just, be triggered into a completely methodological understanding of what took place. What happened? There was a stagflation crisis. There was a selling off of national industries that were unprofitable. And capital benefited from that hugely. There was an opening up of markets which would ultimately lead to more and more cheaper production costs, cheaper prices. But that didn't mean that everything was still cheap because there's a very big opportunity cost. There was going to be even more unemployment for a while, for a considerable while. Under Margaret Thatcher, I think unemployment hit 4 million even. Was it 3 million or 4 million? I was there in 1980-81, and this was all happening. It was riots. It was out of control. But that's what was happening. Plus, you now had whole new portfolios of government, new ministries. Everything was in fact being more corporatised. But the corporatisation was also of the public sector. And professionals working in the public sector wanted to get nice salaries. So I'll give you a very good example of that. The Vice-Chancellor of a university, so let's take one public institution, and this is true, what I'm saying now is true of the police force and hospitals and everything that's to do with the state. There was a massive pay increase to managers. So in a university, a Vice-Chancellor in the mid-1970s used to earn about half as much again as a professor. Now, a Vice-Chancellor, depending which university, will earn anything from 8 times to 12 or 13 or 14 times as much. And the Vice-Chancellor's job is a really managerial job. Plus, they need more and more managerial positions, so that elite grows. The nature of education grows because now the nature of education is seen as having to play a role in fitting industrial needs. So the ministries change. Higher education under the Labor government in Australia in the 1980s became synchronised with industry. No one had ever thought of that before. And in a sense, higher education was an easy target for this, I think, essentially a kind of stripping and pillaging of, or revamp resource transference from one group to another, because most academics then were seen as boffins writing their papers and didn't know much about anything and didn't care about anything other than their research and their teaching. But here you had a group of people that saw, one, it's a very expensive enterprise, having a university. 2, you've got more and more people going to universities. 3, you want to make them more efficient. What is efficiency when it comes to education? I think this is a real nice managerial spoof word that could belong in the Soviet Union, but it hits the whole Western world. So you start bringing all these mechanisms of compliance that academics have to conform to that are designed at a managerial level, and of course the state is saying, look, we have had to, because it's so expensive, we've had to make the universities self-funding as much as they can be. This meant massive increase in fees for students, in the United States especially. One of the reasons identity politics is so big a feature in the United States is because that's what they've learned. They come out as economic agents, but they also have a huge amount of money to pay back for the degree they've got. By God, that narrative better work for them as an economic resource. You know, it's purely economic how this is happening. So, all this is happening. The so-called neoliberal revolution is also a managerial revolution. The managerial revolution is also an elite transfer of resources. It's also a kind of economization of all the spheres of society. In a way, it's kind of much closer to communism than it was to liberalism ever was. Because liberalism had always made accommodations to the public sector as being different. It had to be, you had to watch the pounds and the pennies. But it wasn't, and there were bureaucrats. But the managerial elite were a whole other new group. And the mechanisms of compliance became ever more increasing, so that ultimately meant the kind of autonomy that teachers had, university people had, doctors in hospitals had, the police had. It went through the whole system. All of this became increasingly governed by a compliance mechanism. The other thing was, finally, that was left out of this, and this is again why the word neoliberalism is known. The argument at the time, in the 1980s, make no sense. But the argument at the time, being led by economists, was, remember what I said about lowering taxation? Well, there was some of that. But in the long run, and if you look at the United States, and you think the United States is a low-taxing country, look again. Because you have to look at all the levels of governance where taxation occurs. And in fact, the difference in overall taxation in the United States or in Western Europe, so-called more socialist countries, is negligible. It's really negligible. And then if you look at the United States, the way the defense industry works and private enterprises' desperate need to get resources from the state to fund them for military, you can see that it's just not true. In the long run, taxation didn't really drop very much at all. There were certain tax breaks for certain goods, but welfare didn't diminish that much either. And the reason it didn't, those certain areas of the public sector did, certain things, but you got deprived of a free education. But there were other things compensating for that, other things making up for that. So the state, in a sense, still had to get the revenue to keep the show going. And because there was such high unemployment for a significant period of time, throughout most of the 1980s, again, the US, once it hit under Reagan, that turned around. It took electoral risks that Western countries generally weren't prepared to take. And what else happened in Great Britain, and then eventually came up, much later in Australia? There was a VAT. So there was a new kind of tax as the state needed revenue. We call it the GST. So overall, when you look at state revenue, you can see it didn't decline at all. Or hardly at all. You can see some peaks and troughs in certain years, but overall, it hasn't. It tends to remain steadily up, dropping a bit, and plateauing, then hovering around there. Also, generally, in terms of industry and enterprise, if you want to look at the manuals of, or the regulatory books, or the size of, regulatory legislation that occurred in the 1970s compared to now, you're going to notice. What will you notice? Under Trump, it's being wound back drastically in the US, which is a big reason for the success of the economy. The number of increased exponentially. I've seen the comparative figures. A friend of mine has written a book dealing with this kind of stuff. It's enormous. I can't remember the exact detail, but it's in the multiple thousands of new laws. So is this neoliberal? Of course it's not. So I've banged on and on and on about this simply because the world that is and the names we have about the world that is are often out of kilter with each other. And if you really want to study politics, you have to be very suspicious of the nomenclature, which becomes part of a consensus narrative. And professions reproduce themselves through consensus narratives. And who also thought that? A character called Michel Foucault, who I'll also talk about in a moment. I just want to touch briefly on what I think has been a really dominant theme also in 20th century thought at a more philosophical level. And in some ways, I think the formulation by Max Weber really sums up so many different positions. And his formulation was the iron cage. And he saw the roots of that lying in the developments of the combination of capitalism and bureaucracy. I won't go into that, but the formulation occurs in a book of his called The Spirit of Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic, or The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's a very famous book, and Max Weber is a really great sociologist who noticed that any kind of official thinking, which is based around a kind of what he calls it, or what is called later, he uses the term purpose rationality. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno will use the term instrumental reason, and we see a very similar kind of critique coming from the right-wing philosopher. Adorno and Horkheimer are very left-wing philosophers, social philosophers. Heidegger is very much positioned on the right. He actually joined the Nazi Party for a while. In fact, he kept his membership to the end of the war. There was a huge scandal around that because he denied having done that. But what was being recognised was that this kind of purposefulness in which some kind of either fundamental economic driver, or in the case of Heidegger, it's a broader metaphysical outlook, leads to a kind of spiritual desertification. That's Heidegger's term. It's not a million miles away from what Marx was talking about when he talked about alienation. And indeed, I would say that a common concern of 20th century thinkers, whether on the right or on the left, shares with Marx the recognition of the problem of alienation as being part and parcel of modern society. I think alienation is one of Marx's really best sociological contributions. I just don't believe that he had a solution to the problem. But that there was a problem, and that various other of these figures thought there was a solution to it. I've also got there, on the top is Max Weber, veering over to the right is Martin Heidegger. On the left was another guy that ended up working with the Nazis, a legal theorist called Carl Schmitt. And on the bottom right is a guy called Walter Benjamin, who I've just written a book on that's just come out. So they were seeing the greatest powers and possibilities combined with instrumental rationalization or purpose rationality, as they would call it, were all really contributing to some kind of spiritual death. And Friedrich Nietzsche would also be an important philosopher for many of these thinkers, especially Heidegger, less important for Carl Schmitt, but nevertheless, and Karl Marx also. So some tended to go more with Marx, and they tended to just assume, say, Walter Benjamin, I mentioned Adorno, I mentioned Horkheimer, there's nothing that suggests to me they know anything serious about economics. They basically see or believe that Marx has got it right about economics. But it's not emphasized, but I just think that's impossible to defend, and I think I told you I did my master's thesis on Karl Marx and others. I've looked very closely at the economic stuff. Anyway, I won't repeat that. But they tended, and what they also tended to notice was a commodification of life. And I think that that's true. They're not wrong to see that. The question is whether it's that question of system again. You're still in the system. How can you get around that? And of course, what they were hoping was that the communist experience would get them out of that, would be the solution. Even if, as Benjamin, for example, he never joined the Communist Party, even if they were more fellow travellers, was the term that was frequently used, than members of the Bolshevik Party. Okay. Now, another very important fact to bring in, and I'll be very brief about this, is the youth revolt that took place pretty well globally. And you could even say that Mao had unleashed that in communist China with what was then called the Cultural Revolution. Mao was trying to consolidate himself within the party after the disaster of what was called the Great Leap Forward, where something like 45 million people may have died. Some people do it higher, some a bit lower. But a massive amount of people died through this deranged and crazy idea about people setting up little smelters in their backyard, barefoot doctors, a basic complete transformation of society that was supposed to be unleashed by the energy being let out there and the youth and the Red Guard supporting this. And in a way, oh no, I'll just put another one. In Paris, where there was also this great student revolt, Maoism was a really important part, in a minor current. It's a minor current, but nevertheless, of a number of intellectuals that were very sympathetic to what Marx was doing. Because everything was ultimately about, if we unleash the energy, then we will create a new world. Which is to say that all of history really counts for nothing. That all the institutions that have accrued over time, all in some ways have been basically deficient. And for the youth in the West, the proof of that was the existence of National Socialism and fascism. That these were all the products or the result of Western civilizations, I want to use a theological term, diabolical character or inhuman character, and that included religion and the family and the state and money and the law and so on. All these ultimately, which were really previously seen as the bulwarks of what constituted civilization. Now, in part, this is explicable by the fact that there had been this world war, and out of the world war you had basically different locations, each with their own trauma in a sense, or their own guilt, or their own knowledge of the wrongs of their society. By the way, I don't for a moment think that the Soviets weren't, benefiting from this kind of narrative. And I think they were funding where they could various groups that would push this kind of narrative. And also in the universities, you had people that had, there was a small number, but they magnified in importance in the humanities through basically reading the world through Marxian categories. But each location, so the German students of the 1960s, their parents and grandparents may have been Nazis. The French, it was such a collaborative regime, the French couldn't trust that their parents and grandparents had been in the resistance. In the US, they had dropped the bomb. There was the treatment of blacks, the lack of civil rights. There was the treatment of the American Indians, shame, shame, shame. The UK, the colonial past. Australia, Vietnam, and the treatment of Aboriginals. So they all very much had something that really punctured a kind of happy as we go, everything is improving, liberal, progressive mythos. And the liberal story is a lie, it is a myth. They were right to see it as a lie, and a myth. The issue was, could they get out the system to change the system? And that's what I said. I think that's an impossible thing to do. Just impossible. It's very voluntarist in terms of metaphysical terms. If you talk about on the one side, I might have mentioned this polarity before, I'm sure I did when I talked about Fichte. On the one hand, you can see everything is ruled by laws, and you have seen all the laws, because you know how the system operates, and often, not always, but Marx is a big way to help you see those laws, so they believed. And at the same time, because those laws in place, you have to have an active revolutionary will which you will change it. So you refuse to consent, so you defy the system. That's the essential thinking behind it. And at the same time, because you've come out of very much of a rights culture, you'll have different constituent groups, women, blacks, indigenous peoples, all looking at the harms that have been done to them, thinking about who's to blame, and you've got, remember Who's to Blame? Again, you two might remember, that was the title of a book by Alexander Herzen in Russia. And so this was a really interesting way in which you could see a kind of intellectual continuity between the ideas that drove the Russian Revolution and the right stuff to the French Revolution. If it's wrong, someone is to blame. One of the problems with that, of course, is we're born into the world that we're born into. Now, it is not a world of equality. And you might remember me saying in another context that if you look at archaic social and political formations, you'll see there was a sacrificial dimension And what happened, the reason the French Revolution ultimately broke out is because those in power were no longer seen as making any sacrificial contribution to the social order. And that's true. When that happens, it's a social breakdown. So it was the same kind of perception that was being driven here. But whether or not there was a widespread appreciation of the complexities of history, that's another issue. And I think that the only reason this could take off is because of one very deep-seated idea that goes right back to Rousseau. And that is that people are basically good by nature. And this becomes very much a part of this mindset. See, if you don't believe that, then you're just going to look at what happened as terrible and diabolical and, but you're not going to find an easy way out of this. Now, this was all happening as a sexual revolution. There was a revolution in style. There was a youth generation against the old style. There was a new music to do it. John Lennon could simplify everything in one song, and the youth of the world would think, imagine. But it all is predicated upon a breaking with, which I think was a far more commonplace idea, and that is that life is very tragic, or there's original sin. To use the Christian formulation, but I think the Christian formulation and the tragic way of seeing reality, they actually have a lot in common. Okay. So, who's to blame? There tended to be. In fact, the great, massive socio-political ideas transformation that was developed theoretically, that fed into and came out of the student movement. When I say fed into, because a number of these people, like members of the Frankfurt School, for example, Adorno, Benjamin, Horkheimer, they belong to an earlier generation. And as I said, and someone like Jürgen Habermas in Germany, they all basically saw that there were dominators and dominated. This now is such a typical way of seeing things that it's become the accepted currency. One of the problems with that, though, is, and this was a critique I made of Marx earlier, because it's partly Rousseau and very much Marx. If you look at historical development, you see that there's very few instances where that's so clear-cut. By far, the biggest transformation that occurs in the fabrication or the organic development of what takes place in Western Europe and then circulates through the United Kingdom, through America, so many of the conflicts are at a horizontal level, not a vertical level. Tribes conquering other tribes. Nations conquering other tribes. Of course they've got their leaders, but you've got to remember what the leader was. The leader, a king in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century, 10th, even much longer, ultimately was allied with the military. And you remember that formulation of what was the basis, the legitimation and justification of the estate systems in France? Those who fought, those who prayed, those who laboured. In the US, there was another kind of tradition, and John Rawls is a very important player in that, and he wrote a book called The Theory of Justice in the 1970s, and again, but the focus is upon who are the least advantaged members in the community. Now this was taking place, and there had also been a push for affirmative action to try and rectify the past wrongs. And of course there had been slavery, there were wrongs, there's no doubt about that. So this was an attempt, again, to get out the system, to steer the system, in which you could make equality a part of things. So the idea of the privileged and the unprivileged becomes operative, and you tend to divide society into those two groups. But as I said, in the pre-modern world, that is very hard to sustain for lots and lots of areas. Karl Marx himself, I'm going to repeat a point, I think he shows that he studied, he really knew three things historically. He knew Rome, he knew the French Revolution, and both of those actually kind of conform in a way to that model. And he was also interested in the Asiatic mode of production, where he could make a case for that there, to some extent. Okay. Now, it was really in France, though, apart from the Frankfurt School, and, you know, as I said, there were people like Rawls, and there were some others, and there were some feminist theorists, you know, and then queer theorists would come along. But in terms of the philosophical excavations, they tended to come from France, and they would tend to circulate in the West through literary studies. And again, the trajectory of or the circulatory nature of this narrative legitimation or narrative power and legitimacy, it's somewhat staggered. For example, in the UK, there was the New Left Review, and they were reading people like Antonio Gramsci. They weren't really keen on the French, but later, again, tended to be in cultural studies, which was essentially a discipline set up by a West Indian Brit called Stuart Hall. That tended to, you know, become instantiated and become part and parcel of the curriculum. It tended, and then it sort of flowed into some areas of philosophy, but generally in both the UK and the US to this day, they've been very resistant against this influence. They have another current. They're quite happy to do anti-domination, but they don't so much do it through the French. So much. Now, the interesting thing about the intellectuals of that generation that was so important, and they really took fire from the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, what the big event that occurred in the 1960s in the US was a seminar series, a symposium organized by Dr. René Girard, and he invited many of these top thinkers, and a number of them who weren't making much of a living. They were writing books, they were talked about, but they didn't really dominate the scene of philosophy in Paris, but they really spread amongst the youth movement. In 1966, there was a symposium, and that really captured the imagination of the new generation of academics wanting to work in universities. And that was really, then began the attack upon the idea of there being such a thing as Western Civ courses. And the idea was that essentially all knowledge is political. This is something that came out. Now, I'll just say something very briefly about the background, intellectual background to the Parisians, because this is all Parisian-centric. Unlike in Germany, where Nietzsche was seen as a Nazi, so Jürgen Habermas, for example, I mentioned him in relationship to the Frankfurt School. He and his whole generation, with very few exceptions, saw Nietzsche as a precursor of the Nazis, not because Nietzsche was anti-Semitic, because he wasn't, but because of the distinction he made between the overman and the underman, the subhuman and the superman. So they didn't like Nietzsche. But in France, there had been a very different Nietzsche reception. And Nietzsche was basically seen as someone who was anti-rationality of the Cartesian sort. Remember when we did Descartes? The French tended to see, and again it's part of the intellectual milieu that evolved out of the First World War, when things like Dadaism, Surrealism, and other currents, but they were two major ones in the arts. They had tended to read Nietzsche because he was an anti-Cartesian. And they tended to blame science, scientific philosophy of the sort that Descartes did, as creating a world of machines and a world of killing machines, basically. So they tended to see Nietzsche as a response and a reaction to that. They also, in the main, ignored all the more proto-fascist bits of Nietzsche. So the other person that was really important amongst a number of important teachers, in a sense, often they were writers rather than teaching at a university, were people like Georges Bataille, Maurice Blanchot, Antoine Artaud. He's less fits this, but they had also seen the Marquis de Sade as a libidinous, energistic thinker that they could use against a rationalist culture. So the problem was a rationalist culture. The way out of this was an expressivist, energistic reaction to that. And although de Sade, if you read, I used to teach de Sade writes his books in which there's, very long, very tedious novels that are full of basically transgressional sex, and transgressional sex then meant rape and murder, pedophilia, murdering the kids. It's, in this great big massive carnivals. And they're read by people like Blanchot and Bataille as playful exuberance, as an illustration of what the term that Lacan would use is jouissance, and that would be repeated by Derrida. That's this playful, energistic energy. So it's just the imagination being unleashed. I would point out de Sade, although he actually had gone to prison because of cutting up, not killing, but cutting up and whipping some young prostitute, I think it was, some young girl, and being imprisoned for that. And it was his mother-in-law that was behind it, even though his wife would tend to bring him in sex toys to play with. Anyway, I won't go into that. But, okay. So Sade, Nietzsche, the generation before them had also been very inspired by the philosopher Hegel. But they had read Hegel a certain way. I don't want to go too far into that, but I did mention Hegel in an earlier lecture. And I'll just say this. They tended to react to the Hegelian Marxist twist that was quite strong in France. And during the 1930s, the great lecture series where every intellectual that was anyone could be seen was at the lecture series on Hegel by a Russian communist emigre called Alexander Kojève. And he had basically condensed Hegel into this idea of a struggle for recognitions, which could easily, of course, then be appropriated by Marxism to class struggle, which is exactly how it was taken in the main. And there had also been the existentialist movement, which Sartre and to some extent Camus, but Camus was always an outsider and didn't really, it's the name of one of his books, of course, but an absurdist. He didn't really like that name. But I'll leave. Not very few of these people remotely liked Camus, even though, ironically, in some ways, some of his criticisms of Hegelian Marxism are quite similar to theirs, in fact, identical, and he proceeds. So what you had, though, was an explosion of intellectual activity by these very smart young people. That was the background to it. And each one of these figures that I've written down here were all in some way, shape or form making a social critique. And you might remember when I gave that lecture on Marx, where Marx basically says everything in the world has to be critiqued. So they're doing this. Again, they're able to take themselves out of the system to look at it. So the question is, what are the variables that they draw upon to make their appeal? What are the ultimate appeals? The ultimate appeal, as examples of Sade indicate, is freedom. But almost all of them also gravitate towards Marx. And Heidegger had been important too. Why was Heidegger important? In a nutshell, Heidegger was important because his philosophical story had managed to critique the whole philosophical tradition as all of a piece, contributing to this massification and technological desert of the spirit. So all of these come in some way, and underneath every one of these thinkers, Emmanuel Levinas is somewhat different. But he becomes very important later. In fact, by the 1990s, he starts to emerge as possibly the most important of the philosophers. But he was an early generation. He was a critic of Heidegger, and Derrida, in a very early work, had done a very savage critique of Levinas. And then he turns around and reinvents himself as a disciple of Levinas. Even though they liked each other personally, but their philosophies were at loggerheads until the moment where I think Derrida comes. So what was now? I'm going to quickly just run through these very, very quickly. Some, in the case of Lacan, it was really a celebration of Soissons against the stultifications and ideology of modernity. I'm being very, very simplistic here. In fact, Lacan is one of the ones I like most here. Probably the most, except with Foucault. So I like Foucault in a moment. His work has been appropriated by Slavoj Žižek, who you may have heard of, who's very critical of a lot of post-structuralism, but actually he's so Lacanian. And he's basically Lacan plus Marx. The other thing about Lacan was he was saying that people basically become servient to something they put above themselves that becomes a big other, and this big other is a kind of surrogate goal which restricts their libidinous energy, gain on being. But he was a psychoanalyst, not a philosopher, even though he drew upon Hegel, mainly upon Hegel more than any of the other people that we've mentioned. Okay. Claude Lévi-Strauss was an anthropologist who basically is very critical of Sartre. And his importance was basically seeing all of reality in terms of certain structures that we fit in. And for a short time, Julia Kristeva, who's been a Bulgarian secret police spy that has come out of it, and some of her work is really very smart, historical work, don't get me wrong. But she was basically looking at linguistics in a structural way to basically make the argument that our language is ideologically shaped and we can see these ideological patterns. So again, you've got something going on. You know, we know something outside of language that we're appealing to and able to see. Because if you're just in language, which I think we are, it's the same problem as the system. If you're in it, you're still drawing upon it. They're able to make this disassociation in which they survey it. Jacques Derrida, his main areas were literature and philosophy, and the central idea of Derrida was called deconstruction. And basically what Derrida argued in a nutshell, and there's actually a work called Derrida in a nutshell, which is Conversations with him, by Paul writing, in which, deconstruction in a nutshell it's called, sorry. He basically argues that within any text, there tends to be a center and the decentered components. But every element in a text is so open that it may break free from the system. Now note this. What you basically have is a view of text analogous to society, and the idea of decentering and marginalization then becomes the means by which you make a new critique within the system, because the variable has its own life, its own potential, its own trajectory. So it can destabilize the meaning of the text. And for people doing textual analysis, that is in literary theory, this was fantastic, because it basically meant that you could use the elements of the text to see what are the oppressive components of the text and what are the emancipatory. So you see that dialectic of totality, loose end, if you like. So meaning is not fixed. It's constantly deferred. So you get this idea of difference in Derrida. And difference simply means a constant deferral of meaning because it can which is a kind of individuation of the marginal. So it has its own revolutionary potential to change the meaning not only of the text but of society. Michel Foucault, he tended to focus upon, there's also various philosophical studies, but he's always doing the same thing. It's always very clever, but it's always the same. Michel Foucault basically studies institutions, and he looks at the institutions in terms of their dominance, and again, he's basically positioning himself with those that are marginalised. So he writes on madness, and he ends up having a very big conflict about a reading of Descartes with Derrida. I won't go into that. But ultimately, he's doing something very similar. He's basically saying the normalisation process of society is such in which all these marginalised figures are being oppressed. And he is siding with them for revolutionary potential. In his own trajectory, but then Nietzschean position makes him turn against a lot of the Marxism. But at the end of the day, it's still dominator. I will mention one other idea of Foucault, though, which I think is very important and his best idea. He was very critical, because at this stage he's on the outside. He hasn't become a figure of appeal within disciplines. So disciplines are seen as suspicious because they're generated by professional narratives in which the whole way the narrative works is that there's some object is constructed in the narration, and that object then triggers off the empowerment of that group to draw upon the narrative, create ways of seeing the world, create new objects in the world in order to better control it and enhance their own professional status. So he hated, things like psychiatry, social workers. But, the social workers end up using Foucault to do an internal critique of their own position. But they're still in the position. They haven't given up their job. They haven't given up the profession. So what Foucault talks about discursive regime, that is actually something I see everywhere in play. I think you'd like to see that, but I think the motivation behind it is a problem. Because you don't get rid of the professions by alerting them. In fact, this then becomes a means of disassociation in which if you speak a certain way, then your legitimacy is given a kind of moral leverage. Originally, both Derrida and Foucault were very anti any kind of ethical positioning of their philosophies. They would both present themselves later as ethicists. The best of the philosophers is a guy called Deleuze, and Felix Guattari, who comes from psychoanalysis. The big book, Anti-Oedipus, is a critique of psychiatry. And again, it's really an attack upon the family, and it's really an attack upon those that would try to see this alienation within the family as a social problem that should be cured by the psychoanalyst. They say, no, that's wrong. There's something intrinsically wrong with the thing in itself, the family itself. Deleuze's philosophy emphasizes individuation, difference. What he calls an arboreal logic, in which the part conforms to something above them. He says that's really what Hegel does wrong. He's very anti-Hegel. And he argues that everything is unique and different. But to put it, if I give you a visual picture, if you watch a David Attenborough movie, one of those David Attenborough naturalistic documentaries, or whatever we call it, where you've got swarms of things, moving from place to place. That is really Deleuze's picture of the social. We can create a narrative and a swarm through our difference, and then we can create a new location, a new place in which to rebuild the world. And so he's inciting that. Emmanuel Levinas, he was always an ethicist, and the key point about Levinas is through the recognition in the face of the other. That is the basis, to basically see who the other is. So the whole idea of the self and the other, which has been a very important part of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy as well as the Hegelian philosophy, that becomes central to Levinas. But it's also very anti-totalizing, because he sees that the systemic reduction of the other prevents a genuine encounter. So it's one way of putting a spin on this, or one quick way of talking about this, is to say Levinas is primarily concerned with the encounter in which we really hear and listen to the suffering of the other that we're engaging with. And in and of itself, I think that's a very noble kind of thing too. But whether or not the actual positioning of what constitutes otherness and what constitutes self is adequately thought through, then becomes a question, because you have to say, how good is a history? How good is a sociology? And what you will notice about Levinas is there's no sociology or history. It's kind of implicit, and again, it's implicit in terms of the kind of categories that you can then take from Marxism or somewhere else like that, and then you project onto. But it's very ahistorical. Another one is Jean-Francois Lyotard. He wrote the report on the postmodern condition, and this is it. So you can see every one of these. You can see. I hope you can see that as different as they all are, they sort of squabbled amongst each other. There's very much a common set of concerns that are driving them. Lyotard had come out of the Marxist tradition. Again, he would be critical of Marx, and he argues that the postmodern condition is one in which these great big meta-narratives of liberalism and Marxism especially is what he's got in mind. We have to break all that. We must look at the minority narrative. And within that minority narrative, we see that we're able to make all these alliances. See, very political. We're able to make all these alliances. That will do what? What will it do? Well, it will emancipate us. All about emancipation. And of course, the reason that you need to, that you've got a minority and the non-minority is because of inequality. So again, it's destabilizing. All of this is about destabilization of a totality that is experienced as oppressive. All of these, by the way, are living, amongst the most privileged human beings at a time in history. It's the best time to live, but they don't have the mega wealth of super capitalists. But when people say the 1%, well, everybody pretty well in the West could be part of this 1% if they're middle class or above. Jean Baudrillard is one of my favourites as well. He tended to look at the world through the problem of simulacra and simulacrum. And that is basically saying, again, there's this proliferation, this endless proliferation of narrative, because there's really no core that's true. Everything in our world is play upon play upon play. So that idea of Joissons. Pierre Bourdieu doesn't quite fit, but he's kind of. I see a very Marxian kind of sociology is a name that he will come up with. Roland Barthes, who's in mythology, who was basically doing a structuralist reading of literature, closer to Christophe in some ways. And Louis Althusser was doing a rereading of Marx, but which he was also drawing upon some of these others. He mentions Foucault a number of times. But ultimately, Marx has got the answer. He's really saying Marx has got the essential answer. So he makes a division between what he calls a scientific Marx, a mature Marx of capital, and a young Marx. He says that all that stuff he does about alienation isn't really true. And you think, why? Why do you have to do that? And it's because he's a structuralist. He's emphasizing structure. So agency doesn't mean anything apart from the class in which you're operating. But class is now shifted with these other people now to other minority groups, so it's not class in and of itself. So the whole, you see this dialectic at work. You've got a kind of Marxian base as a component, but there are all these other elements in the mix. Mean that eventually, unless you're someone like Marx or Zizek, Laker, not Marx, Althusser, you hang on for your dear life to the Marxian component. Other features of identity in the formation or difference, other features of that difference will be accentuated in these new alignments of solidarity. I think I've spoken a lot about this. Can I have 10 more minutes? Grudgingly. Okay. Some other things that come out is the idea of the death of the author or the death of the subject. These are big things. Why is this important? Because ultimately the subject is governed, is dictated to, by those narratives or embodiment or instantiation within the larger group of which it's a member. See, there's a reconfiguration. They don't actually completely destroy totalization because that would make them libertarians. And they're not. They're kind of, but not. Because they still want this political solidarity. And they would see the libertarian as not really having any basis of solidarity, which would be right, up to a point. So you see this attack upon the subject. And this is when Jordan Peterson, who, look, he got so much flack, and I think so much of it is unfair. But he doesn't really know postmodern philosophy very well. Whether it's worth knowing well is another question. Whether you think it's good is another question. I've been reading this stuff for 4 decades. I'm not overly impressed with it, let me just say. Bits and pieces of it. But compared to Tocqueville or some other figures that I think are really significant, I think the problem with them is all they're making the same move around the same assumption. And the variants within it, I think, are ultimately problematic. Because they simultaneously want to disengage you out of the totality, but they keep bringing you into another totality for their political ends. But they have no way of guaranteeing that their political ends will really be as emancipative as they think. And secondly, I don't actually think emancipation as an end is a very good end. I don't think it amounts to very much at all. If you're in a prison and you want to get out, yes. But when you're talking within this kind of world that we live in, I think you have to frame things in a certain way so that you can actually be very privileged, but you present yourself as not privileged. You can be going to one of the best universities in the world, you can be a professor in there, but you're nevertheless able to identify with being one of the victims of the world. See, I think this kind of disassociation, which I would take back to Rousseau, is a serious problem that never enters into the analysis. And I always think in any analysis you make, if there's a big, big idea at work there, and someone starts, like me, comes along and starts, and other people I read and like, starts tugging away at it, you see the whole thing will start to collapse. And then you may go through rummage through the rubble and find the bits and pieces you think are okay. I mentioned Baudrillard. I think one of the very good things about Baudrillard, and to some extent Foucault and various others, is that they do tend to bring out the more nightmarish qualities of the 20th century. But I think if you really want to know them, go and read Kafka. I think the best they do is basically Kafka with politics thrown in. I think Kafka is better without the politics. So even another thing that they criticised was this idea of humanity. Humanism is a big part of their critique. Again, that's something that also Jordan Peterson picks up on. He knows that about them. Why do they pick up on that? Obvious, isn't it? Humanism is too big a totality. You've got to look at the different alignments and groupings. So man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. There's a real irony, isn't there, that one of the founders of identity politics is so against the idea of identity because everything is supposed to be about difference. But it's, of course, the identity within the difference that ends up being rescued as opposed to what it was that the Lewis had hoped would happen. But because he wanted solidarity in that swarming of what he would call getting out of one territory into another territory, a deterritorialization and reterritorialization, that you end up with this contradiction. Now, I never think something's wrong because it contradicts itself. Everything contradicts itself. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just drawing your attention to the fact at the time, the kind of nomenclature, and start following that through. I think the real problem is not that it contradicts itself. I think what's holding it all together is too limited, philosophically limited. Contingency, the negative and the marginal take priority over the system of law. I've said this. In Jacques Derrida's grammatology, he sees writing doing this over speaking. He talks about the endless significance of the supplement. Every totality is unravelled by its own. And so you can see, this is all variance. You can read that. I won't even bother going through it, because I've given you the essence of it. If you can put two and two together, I don't need to go further with it. It's so there. This playoff, this affirmative meaning, it's all about openness and play. But at the same time, once it becomes politicised, you cannot help but be part of a discursive narrative, which is now playing itself out the way that these guys never would have imagined. And in part, it's to do with the fact, in France, it was all anarchical. Once it went to the US, it was all policy-driven. But they all made it, or most of them made a killing in the US. That's where they sold their books by the book. The other point in grammatology is his treatment of Plato that the cure is the poison. The cure is the poison. So you think you read the state of good health, but that's really going to be your undoing. Of course, it's an attack upon the normal family, the normal thing, the normal this, the normal that. It is an attack upon it, very understandable. And it's true that the normal, I don't like words like the normal. I'm sympathetic enough to what they're saying, you know. If you just appeal to the family, you've got to deal with the fact that terrible things take place in families. At the same time, you've also got to deal with the fact that when you don't have families, terrible things can happen too. Different terrible things. The world is a difficult, tough, and terrible place. But it is true, if you're in a diabolical family, there's probably no worse place to be. So I don't lack sympathy with that. It's just not obvious to me how you get around that. There's a presence of absence is a big Derridean thing, a presence of absence. So you don't think it's there, but it's really dictating and governing you. That's that. Okay, I've said all this. I'll just mention Walter Benjamin very quickly. His idea is the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. Benjamin, unlike Marx, basically saw the history of the world as one in which progress is a terrible thing. He talked about the angel looking back on the wreckage of history. So what we need to do is revive the oppressed. Again, two things, that you revive the voices of the oppressed. Again, this is a very common way of seeing the world today.
Who said that, sorry?
Walter Benjamin.
Okay.
I'm going to skip Leotard. I wanted to put that in. It's the same. They're all doing the same thing. I can't, you know, really. I could go on, you know, I could go on. And some people like this one as opposed to that one. They like this one. They're taking the same basic moves, operating in a different way. He's operating against the idea of meta-narrative. He's operating against the idea. He's looking at the modern world. He's trying to free up regions of difference in which there's other narratives, in which there's no major narrative which you can conform to. So it's a narrative openness, which I don't, in and of itself, I have no problem with that. I think that's great. But as I said, but there's still this equality freedom problem. It's not enough. It's just not enough. This is a great problem of post-enlightenment thinking. The hegemony of Western forms of thinking is such, because again, you two are going into detail, I think, during the other class, but it's such a part of a Western elite formation that it really blinds people to seeing what's going on in Russia, China, the Middle East, and Africa. Except for those people that are able to engage in this kind of discourse, of which there are some. So there's a whole lot of people generally working in Western universities or very high position in post-colonial universities that are very happy to use this narrative. How much leverage do they have in the narratives of their own societies? Zero. How much leverage do they have amongst the Western intelligentsia and Western students? Quite a lot in certain disciplines. Where are we now with all this? My quick summation of all that we've been looking for is, first of all, the ideas that we've gone through, the traditions we've looked through. They have all shaped the world in some ways, very important ways. A number of these ways we just take for granted, even though as they lose roots, it doesn't mean that the fruits of them will continue to be there for other generations. It is impossible to ignore the fact that the Greeks, the Jews, the Christians, and less so in terms of ideas, but certainly in terms of sociological outplay, which then affects the ideas of Germanic tribes. These have all been part of our world. The kind of ideas that came out, or the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, they were a mixture of liberalism, socialism, and even fascism. Eugenics was once considered a very scientific discipline, and it was even considered as progressive. And Charles Darwin, whose blessed university we live at, his relationship to the eugenics movement and social Darwinism cannot be ignored. His cousin Francis Galton was very big in the eugenics movement. But you look at the subtitle of The Origin of Species. Look that up and you'll see what I mean. The geopolitical problems that are taking place today. I don't think that the generation of the 60s and these ideas have all equipped one to be able to look at these other components in which freedom as such, equality as such, don't really operate in this flowing way. I hope from doing this course that I've thrown a lot of stuff at you that makes you think the world is a difficult place to fathom. I hope I've helped you transition from thinking the little you know is all you need to know into realizing how little you know is only the beginning of a long journey.